question in the back. Please take the. I'm sorry. Use the mic, please.
When fellow Muslims were being under attack in Bosnia, despite the fact that they were Sunni, Iran came on very, very strong to defend them, to the point of intelligence operations and intelligence training to the Bosnians. When China assaults the East Turkestan or Hui minorities, is there buzz in Iran about that? Or has, even if there is buzz, has Ahmadinejad sort of said, cool it guys, we need these Chinese? Is there any sort of concern over the anti-Muslim rhetoric and actions in Iran that could throw a monkey wrench in this oil trade?
Sort of in the cultural religious stuff, I mean, it's obviously not my expertise. I'm sure there are people who sympathize, but it doesn't seem to be a major problem. It's to me sometimes a little bit amazing. I mean, the relationship both between the Chinese and Iran, and that where issues like this come up, or China and Venezuela, the fact, or China or Iran and Chavez. I mean, clearly Ahmadinejad and the government do things that are so anti-democratic and against all the principles, even principles that Chavez stands up for in his country, but yet it's sort of glossed over. There's actually the lead article written by a nameless or an unnamed diplomat points out in the current issue of the Middle East Journal, talks about the Iran and the president in particular having sort of three different streams. There's a nationalist stream, there's sort of a third worldist stream, and there's also the Islamic stream. And sometimes they come in contradiction to each other, but people kind of choose from what works. So if it contradicts your Islamic stream to make a coalition with somebody, there's a sort of third worldist one. I would fall back to say, well, political economics, and then people have their limits. And, you know, they're under extreme pressure, Iran, right now. If the Chinese want to help them, I mean, you talk to Iranians, and they very bitterly complain about the Chinese products flowing in, a significant section of the Iranian capitalist class getting wiped out by cheap Chinese products. Similar thing taking place in Venezuela, where Chavez advertises them on television, actually. So you're doing things against your self-interest because of some other interest, national, what he sees as, or just preservation of the regime.
Bosnia never supplied oil.
Well, there's that too, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not the guy to ask for the particular detail.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Raghuveer Goyal from India Globe and Asia Today. My question is that everybody is after Iranian oil today. And future fight, of course, is going to be either on oil or water. Now, there's a tension between the U.S. and China, tension between the U.S. and Iran, and there's a tension in the Middle East. And this is where all the oil comes. So now it looks like U.S. is softening a little bit on Iran as far as sanctions and others are concerned.
Softening,
but on Iran, where does this Iranian nuclear issue will fit into this as far as Middle East crisis with Israel is concerned and the oil?
If I could just ask you, I'm not clear. How are they softening on Iran with the sanctions, the U.S.?
Yeah, a little bit now. President Obama yesterday said that, this morning, that door is open and Iran, as far diplomacy is concerned, and they are willing to talk in the future. So where is this all heading in the future as far as oil supply is concerned?
So so you particularly want to know about the relation with Israel, especially? Okay. I mean, something that it strikes me, you notice the picture I painted didn't talk about Israel. But obviously the U.S. has complicated long-term relationship with Israel in the Middle East, and there's that. One thing I think is interesting to think about is that the U.S. has its own national interests. I think that mostly have to do with something like this, of why they're there, whoever they have historical ties with. Israel has its own national interests that come from a certain place and where they're going to be for a long time, and certain things they have to settle. So, Israel might have its own reasons why it has a problem with Iran. I mean, anybody in Israel's neighborhood who also gets a bomb, there's not going to be a war to the finish with them. There's not going to be a regime change. Once somebody really has a bomb that you can deliver, you don't think about having the same kind of. You might have wars, but they don't get existential. There's certain limits. there's a certain type of recognition that takes place. So Israel has its reasons for that. The United States, on the other hand, and they might want to move, but the United States, on the other hand, I think, is moving from something like this, and really would like to, I believe, calm down things in the Middle East and disengage to some extent. It's really only one more, aside from all the terrible things and the mistakes and the, I would say, morally reprehensible things, decisions that were made probably in the invasion of Iraq. If you want to look at it just sort of objectively standing back, if you look at the countries in OPEC that were a problem for this system, that had economic reasons to cause trouble in the market and for the U.S. in the security system, they've almost all been flipped, with the exception, Libya, Iraq, and so forth, with the exception of Iran. And so if something could be settled with Iran, the U.S. wants to pay attention to other parts of the world. There's all this concentration there. So they have their own interests that are somewhat different. I don't know if that...
About the tension between the U.S. and China and the rise of China because of this security needs in the future?
I think, yeah. There's a sort of immediate, and then there's a long term, okay? And it's a complicated question. Depends what continent you're talking about. As far as China really causing any problem for the energy system, from what I showed you, no. In fact, if the Chinese go out and develop oil, it gets more oil on the market. They invest their money. They're sitting on all these dollars. So to a certain extent, it sort of doesn't matter if some other oil is developed and goes in this other channel, and to a certain point. Now, if a country like Iran or a country like Venezuela ends up being something like a neo-colony, now it probably has some problems for the United States, okay, in that sort of thing. So, how far does that relationship go?
All righty, we have a couple of questions from the overflow room. Mr. Lucas from Foreign Policy Magazine, how will the renewed sanctions from the U.S. and EU affect Iranian gas development going forward, given that they will not have access to the most advanced, development technology? Yeah. And then the second one from the Oxford group, several years ago, China signed a $100 billion deal to develop Iranian oil fields. SIMPEC is involved in several refinery projects. Can you comment? Most importantly, the Foreign Policy Magazine.
Yeah, that was the question about the gas. Well, yeah. I mean, Iran has huge gas deposits, and it has been so far unable to develop them. And there's many reasons, not just to make money, but there's you can make a lot of money. I mean, it's not just to make more money or something. There's a lot of strategic reasons that they might want to do it. From what I understand, a lot of the Iranian oil fields, given the geology, and there's some debate about these things, but it's unlike, say, in Saudi Arabia where you want to inject salt water, you want to inject gas. So it's important to get that. But meanwhile, those oil fields and the gas fields aren't in the same place. They also have a problem with, even though there's all this gas, you need it in the population centers. There is, all these subsidies on gas. And there's a real problem getting gas to generate electricity. They have problems with building that infrastructure as well. And a number of people argued just a few years ago, and looking at this, that in fact that might be one of the urges of one of the reasons that the government moves in the direction of a nuclear program for cities like Tehran or something, because of the complexity of developing oil, the gas, and bringing it there for generation. All right.